Hello everyone, welcome to Pete CD Final World. Today I'm going to do a video that I wanted to do for a while, but I was going to actually start in the late 60s and go to, I'm not sure what year, but I was going to list my favorite albums from each year. But then I realized that from the late 60s to the maybe like 1970 or 71, most of the albums would be like Beatles or Rolling Stones, Who, Kinks, so it would be all the same. So since I'm turning 50 a couple of weeks, I figured I'd go back to 1974 and start there and start doing videos here and there of my favorite albums, starting with 74 and going on from there. Don't know where I'm going to stop because obviously I'm not going to go much past like the mid to late 90s probably, just because there aren't a lot of bands I was into at that point. Definitely not really into the 2000s probably, but we'll see how far we get. So each year it might have a different amount of albums too, because I'm trying to keep it to albums that I have like a physical copy of or I'm like really familiar with. I just don't want to include something just because people say it's like a great album. So you'll notice I'll probably have some like glaring omissions for what people think are, the best albums from that year. But these are my choices, my favorite albums. So I'm just going to go from there. So the first year, 74, we're going to start with. I have 25. There's a couple of bands I have in here that actually had two albums in 74. So I'm sort of counting that as one. So there might be like actually like 27 or 28 in this list. So that's where we're at. So let me start off with one that I forgot to grab, but it's actually one of the first albums I had from Alice Cooper, and that's his greatest hits album. The reason why I like this album so much is because it sort of wraps up the early period pretty well as far as like the bigger songs. It was also the first album. I don't know if it's the first album I had from him. It was the one that I listened to a lot. So it has everything from Love It to Death through Muscle of Love. I think it has one song from Muscle of Love. It also has the single Teenage Lament 74, which I thought was on Muscle of Love, and apparently not. I actually thought Muscle of Love was from 74 also. That's another thing when you're doing these year by year things. Some albums you think are like the year before or after and so on. So it sort of reminds you what years these albums actually came out. So first one is from the band Yes. It's Relayer. This is actually not one of my favorite albums from them. Basically because the first side takes up the song is Gates of Delirium. I'm not that crazy about that song. The second half of the song is known as the song Soon, which is sort of like an acoustic song with just John Anderson. I like that a lot. The second side, To Be Over and Sound Chaser, they're pretty good. This is predominantly guitar bass because this is the one with Patrick Moraz on keyboard. So there's a lot of Steve Howe guitar on here. His tone is not great as usual, but overall, I kind of had to include it just because it's Yes, and the cover is so awesome. So that's that. Next one is a band called the Good Rats, and the album's called Tasty. If you don't know the Good Rats, they were sort of I don't want to say a local band, but they were big in like the tri-state area of like New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. They went back and forth sort of being on major label. They had a couple albums here and there on major labels, but mostly they were distributed by Gem, which was part of CBS, but their record company is like Rat City Records. But there's sort of a combination of like hard rock, almost jazzy like, and they do some instrumental. The guitar player is really good. His name is John Gatto. Not well known, obviously, but pretty well known was the drummer who was Joe Franco, who later replaced AJ Pero in Twisted Sister, because the Twisted Sister in the early club days used to play with these guys a lot in New York and Long Island, etc. But this is a pretty good album. If you ever see one of their albums, pick it up because it's kind of strange, but they were good. Next up is Frank Zappa Apostrophe. This is sort of my favorite era of Zappa. I would say the early 70s through the early 80s. This one, the whole first side of the album is sort of like one big long story, but it includes Don't Eat the Yellow Snow. A lot of cool guitar on here. Sort of, I don't want to say funky, but it's definitely on the funkier side to more of his stuff. Not very proggy. Yeah, this is one of them that I had early on. I had gotten a couple of his albums from different eras, and when I finally got this one, I realized this is the era I like the best. I also want to mention Roxy and Elsewhere, which is a live album, but is mostly newer songs. He did that a lot on his albums, so it's Apostrophe. Coming in next. Oh, I forgot to say that I'm not ranking these in any type of order because I think it just became too difficult. I was going to try to do that at first, but when you're talking about different bands and different styles of music, you know, it kind of gets difficult that way. But this is the first Rush album. The only one without Neil Peart, the drummer, was John Rutsey. I'm sure you know some of the songs on here: Finding My Way, Working Man. So more of a blues rock bass, sort of like the first Led Zeppelin album, say. Pretty heavy, but still like a lot of good songs on here. A pretty good debut. Pretty heavy sounding, production-wise, too. Next up is Daryl Hall and John Oates, War Babies. I think this is their third album. It's produced by Todd Rundgren. It's not like any other album they ever made. Definitely sort of hard power pop, Rundgren-esque music. There's a lot of cool lead guitar on here because he actually plays on lead guitar on here. Because John Oates is always listed as just guitar. I don't think he ever plays lead, really. Is It a Star is probably like the only well-known song. And maybe War Baby Son of Zorro is sort of known, but it's kind of like it's an anomaly in their catalog, but it's still pretty cool nonetheless. Next up, Johnny Winter. This is John Dawson Winter the third. Another one of his hard rock sort of style albums, hard blues or whatever you want to call it. Probably the best known song on here is Rock and Roll People. But overall, if you like Still Alive and Well, it's in that same style. Speaking of Todd Rundgren, this was the first Utopia album. So the second side takes up one song called The Icon. Big, long Frank Zappa-esque song. Utopia later on in the late 70s, early 80s became sort of like a power pop band, but this is more proggy. It's definitely pretty interesting. So Todd Rundgren does all types of weird music. You can find this pretty cheap. I would pick it up if you're like a Zappa fan and you never heard this. Going in the completely opposite direction is the first Bad Company album. Everybody knows probably at least half of these songs. Can't Get Enough, Rock Steady, Ready for Love, Bad Company, Seagull. Not a huge fan of theirs. I'm surprised they haven't been nominated to get in the Rock Hall, along with just Paul Rodgers, but still a solid album. David Bowie, David Live. It's a pretty good live album. I think at the time, this is the first live album he put out because they put out some Ziggy Stardust stuff live, but it's come out more recently. Even though by then that band This is all new band, but still plays a lot of those early songs on here, and they're pretty heavy. I believe he also released Diamond Dogs in '74 also, which has the big hit Rebel Rebel, but this is a pretty good album. Next up is the Rolling Stones, It's Only Rock and Roll. This is sort of where I really became a fan of theirs. I do like a lot of their earlier 70s stuff, like Exile on Main Street. But from here on, even through the present days, where I really like the Stones more. This album's almost, I don't want to say glammy, but if you look at them at the time, they sort of were borderline dressing a little glammy and sort of, I guess, getting out of that cliched bluesy rock thing. But this still has Mick Ronson, I can't think of his name right now, on guitar. This last one, I think, before Ron Wood, John. Mick Taylor, that's it. Jethro Tull, War Child. A lot of people, I think, don't like this, but I think it's a pretty good album. The title track, Skating Away on the Thin Ice of a New Day, Bungle in the Jungle, Backdoor Angels. This is a pretty solid album, I think. I don't know what the theme or the storyline is supposed to be. It supposedly has one, but it's still pretty good. Ted Nugent and the Amboy Dukes actually released their last two albums in '74. So this is Call of the Wild, pretty solid early proto-metal hard rock album. This is the last one with their singer. Can't think of his name right now, but it's still got some instrumentals on here. It's pretty good. But then later on, they released Ted Nugent's Amboy Dukes, and this one is just Ted and the bass player, Rob Grange. So it's basically almost like the original Nugent band without Derek St. Holmes. A couple instrumentals on here too. There's actually two songs on Double Live Gonzo from here, Great White Buffalo and Hibernation. But this is definitely, like a lot of people don't consider this his first album. I consider this his first album right before the Ted Nugent album. But if you see that, it's definitely great. Next up is a compilation. So I'm also going to include live albums and compilations in my list because, like I included Alice Cooper's Greatest Hits earlier, because those particular albums, especially older compilations and live albums, sometimes are bands' best albums in a way. This was a collection of just what it says, odds and sods, all either singles or B-sides to singles, and there's some new songs on here like Long Live Rock. What else is on here? I think Postcard is a new song. New, I guess I'm saying, was at least a recent single at the time. But this has come out in different configurations. So the reissue CD has different bonus tracks than, say, this one. So this is a double album. The original was one album. But I think if you've gotten either their box set or their mastered CDs, you pretty much have all of those songs anyway. But sort of essential to get all of these Who things because a lot of their singles are not on their albums. Coming up next is Steely Dan, Pretzel Logic. Probably will include all the Steely Dans from here on because of they're all great. This one's got Ricky Don't Lose That Number, Night by Night, Any Major Dude Will Tell You, and the title track. This is the first one. I mean, the last one with Jeff Skunk Baxter. He went on to the Doobie Brothers, and I guess this is considered like the last one with somewhat of the original band they had. Another band that released two albums in the same year, 74, was Queen. So first we have Queen 2. Really dark, heavy album. A lot of people list this as one of their favorites nowadays, even though the only well-known song from it really is Seven Seas of Rye, maybe March of the Black Queen or Orgy Battle. But this is the last one without any of those little, Freddie Mercury old-time piano songs. And then in the same year, they also released Sheer Heart Attack. One of my favorites, I guess, because I had this from early on. Has one of their heaviest songs ever, Stone Cold Crazy. Probably one of the heaviest songs from any band at that time when they released it. Killer Queen is probably the biggest song on here. Now I'm Here was a big concert favorite. And Brighton Rock also. So it's one of my favorites from them. Next up is Bachman Turner Overdrive, Not Fragile. Pretty heavy album, especially the title track. I think that's the best song on here. You Ain't Seen Nothing Yet is probably the song everyone knows off of here, right? But the rest of it is actually pretty heavy. Next up is sort of an odd album and band, to be honest. Renaissance, Turn of the Cards. They sound exactly like you would think from their title. They sound like they're known as prog, but really it's almost like old-time Renaissance music in a way. They have a female singer, Annie Hassam. But a lot of the music is on the darker side, so it's almost like, I don't want to say creepy, but it's really definitely different. The best song on here to me is Black Flame. I'm surprised the metal band maybe hasn't covered that, but this is the only album I have from them, so I'm curious to pick up some when I see them for $1 or whatever. Next up, Oyster Cult, Secret Treaties. I ranked this number 1 in my ranking for them. Overall, I think it's one of the best hard rock albums ever. I think every song is a well-known Oyster Cult song, pretty much except KG Cretins maybe, but it's got Career of Evil, Subhuman, Dominance and Submission, MA 262, Harvester of Eyes, Flaming Telepath, Astronomy. So I would say like 7 out of the 8 are really well-known songs on this one. The first one, this is their third album, but it's the first one that definitely goes from sounding like sort of like a heavy San Francisco band to just a full-fledged hard rock band, I think. Next up, Mott. And this one is called The Hoople. The one before this was called Mott. So it's sort of a 2-album series. I have a few albums from them. Sort of like known as like just like rock and roll, but this album in particular has like sort of like almost like Queen background vocal elements, very English sounding. I guess maybe that's why they weren't that big in the US. Probably the best known song on here is Golden Age of Rock and Roll. Crash Street Kids maybe might be a well-known one. But overall, solid album. If you could pick up their albums pretty cheap, and they're definitely worth getting. Next up, the first Kansas album. This, a lot of people have the debate whether they're prog or not. They definitely have prog elements. The reason I wouldn't say they're not fully prog is usually prog bands, to me at least, have like 1 or 2 virtuoso musicians. And I don't necessarily hear that in the guitar player or keyboard player. Not that they're not good, but they're just not on the level of like, say, the guys in Genesis or whoever. But the songwriting is on the proggier side. Probably the best song is the opening track, Can I Tell You? But yeah, The Pilgrimage also. Definitely hear the beginnings of their sound, and the cover is awesome also. Next up is Lou Reed, Rock and Roll Animal. It's a live album, and it has Steve Hunter and Dick Wagner, best known for playing with Alice Cooper. But he was, they were basically like Bob Ezrin's studio guitar players. And I guess maybe the album before this, Bob Ezrin produced possibly. Is that maybe that's why they end up playing in here. But he does several Velvet Underground songs on here, but they're much heavier and tighter and just don't sound like a shitty garage band to me. I'm not a huge Lou Reed fan, but this is probably the era I like, if you ask me. But this is a pretty good live album. Next up is Deep Purple Burn, another band that put out 2 albums in '74. I didn't know that. I thought Stormbringer was a little later, but apparently it came out the end of the year. But I don't have a copy of that to show you. But it's actually one of my, higher ranking Deep Purple albums, I would say. The only thing about this album is you would think if you know the opening track, Burn, which I'm sure everybody does, you would think this album would be like really heavy. It's really not that heavy, even compared to the Deep Purple albums that came before this. It's definitely moving towards that funkier sound that they did more of on Stormbringer. But still, every song is pretty good on here. The other well-known song on here is Mistreated. Lay Down, Stay Down, Might Just Take Your Life. It's all solid. But the opening track alone, even if that was the only song on here, that'd still be worth it. And finally, Kiss. They had 2 albums in '74. The Debut, and of course, Hotter Than Hell. Hotter Than Hell, known for the sort of production that is almost sounds like a bad cassette dub of somebody else's, Wish they would be able to clean up the tracks somehow. They did it on double platinum. A couple songs are on there, but still has some of their best songs, which are only found on here, like Going Blind. Strange Ways has one of the best Ace solos. The Debut, everybody knows pretty much every song on here. But as great as it is, I prefer most of these songs that ended up on Kiss Alive. So anyway, that's my list for my favorite albums of 1974. In my list, you probably won't see any Crosby, Stills, and Nash or any of that kind of stuff in my list for each year. So if people start saying, hey, where's this album or where's this album? Like I said, it's a number of reasons. Either I don't have a physical copy, I'm not familiar with it, or I just don't like the band, so I'm not going to list it in my top 20 or 25 or whatever. Anyway, if you like these videos, please subscribe, and I'll talk to you later. Thank you.